The night my husband told me to head home from his own company's awards gala, I smiled, picked up my clutch, and walked out of that ballroom without looking back. He thought he'd won something. He had no idea what he'd already set in motion. Let me back up 6 weeks, because that's where this really starts. My name is Claudia. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent the last 4 years working as a regional compliance manager for a biotech company based in Atlanta. My entire job is locating what people are trying to conceal. Contract violations, policy breaches, undisclosed conflicts of interest. I review documentation for a living. I build files that hold up under legal scrutiny. I have never once submitted an incomplete report. It is genuinely embarrassing, in retrospect, how incomplete I allowed myself to be about my own marriage. My husband and I met at a charity auction at the Fernbank Museum when I was 26. He was 30, recently promoted to director at a commercial real estate firm in Midtown, the kind of man who looked comfortable in a room full of people he was quietly trying to impress. He had an easy laugh and he asked real questions about my work, about what I actually thought about things, not just the polite conversational filler most people substitute for interest. We dated for a year. He proposed on the rooftop of a restaurant in Midtown on a Friday in October, when the Atlanta skyline was lit up orange behind us. We got married the following spring at a botanical garden his mother had found online and immediately decided was the only possible venue. 200 guests, white roses, a band that played until midnight. For the first 3 years, we were solid. Not perfectly anything. Nobody is, but solid. We bought a house in Sandy Springs with oak floors and a backyard he always said he wanted for a dog we never quite got around to getting. We had couple friends we actually liked. We split the cooking without negotiating it every time. We made each other laugh. Then something shifted, and I didn't name it for a long time, because naming it would have required deciding what to do about it. It started with small things. He stopped asking about my day the way he used to. Not all at once, gradually, the way a sound fades when you walk away from it, so slowly you don't notice until the silence is complete. His phone started spending a lot of time face down on whatever surface was nearest. He began staying late at the office, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, with the kind of consistency that felt less like work and more like scheduling. He switched to going to the gym before work, rather than in the evenings, which meant he was always already showered by the time I saw him in the morning. I told myself these were normal things, that marriages settle into new rhythms, that ambition can look like distance from the inside. Then her name started appearing. He mentioned her first in early September casually, over takeout on the couch. His company had brought in a new account coordinator, someone with a sharp eye for client presentations, strong instincts, real potential. He said her name once and moved on. I noted it, filed it, said nothing. By the 3rd week of September, I had heard her name 17 times. I counted because I am, professionally and temperamentally, someone who counts things. It isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition, and it is literally what I do for a living. 17 mentions in 15 days. Each one slightly more animated than the last. The particular warmth in his voice when he said her name. The same lightness I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to calculate. I tried to ask about her once. We were having dinner at the kitchen table, which we'd stopped doing regularly, but had started again because I was making an effort. I kept my tone easy and asked how long she'd been with the firm. He put his fork down. He looked at me the way people look when they've decided a question means more than it does. He said, "Why?" I said I was just curious that he talked about her often. He said he talked about lots of people from work. I said not like this. He said I was keeping score, and that wasn't healthy. I said I wasn't keeping score, I was having a conversation. He went to bed without finishing dinner. I sat alone at that table for a while, feeling something I couldn't quite name yet. Not fear, not certainty. Something that lived precisely between the two. 2 weeks later, I found the receipt. He'd charged a room at the Lowe's Midtown to our joint visa on a Tuesday night. Check-in at 6:57 p.m. Check-out the following morning. I found it in the email account we shared for household expenses. He'd been forwarding business receipts there for tax purposes since we got married, and this one landed automatically because it charged the same card. The room rate was $340. The in-room dinner charge was for 2 people. The wine was $84 a bottle. He had told me that Tuesday he was at a client dinner that ran long, and he'd stayed at a colleague's place rather than drive home late. I photographed the receipt on my phone. I created a folder on my work laptop, labeled it vendor contracts, because I know how to file something so that no one looks at it twice, and I saved it there. Then I began reviewing the shared account more carefully. Over the previous 6 weeks, there were 4 charges I hadn't noticed: a restaurant in Buckhead, twice, a hotel bar, and a jewelry store on Peachtree Road, the kind of boutique that doesn't put item descriptions on receipts. Just the store name and a dollar total. $940 on a random Thursday in August. I built a spreadsheet: dates, locations, amounts, notes. My compliance brain engaged fully, which was either a professional reflex or a way of staying functional, probably both. 3 weeks before the gala, on a Tuesday afternoon, I drove to a private investigator's office in Decatur I'd found through a careful search on my work computer during lunch. She was thorough, she was discreet, and when I described what I was looking for, she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She took the relevant details and told me I'd have a preliminary report within 5 business days. 4 days later, sitting in my car in the parking deck at work, I opened the PDF she'd sent. It was 21 pages. I read every one. He had been seeing her for at least 9 weeks. The Tuesday and Thursday evenings were consistent: a hotel or her apartment in Buckhead, or both. There were time-stamped photographs of them entering a parking garage together, of him leaving her building before sunrise, of them at a restaurant with his hand covering hers on the table. The kind of documentation that doesn't leave room for alternative interpretations. He was also her direct supervisor. He approved her expense reports, her time-off requests, her quarterly performance reviews. His firm had a written ethics policy. I know this because I had looked it up, because when you work in compliance, you read other organizations' ethics codes, the way other people read menus, with an explicit provision prohibiting supervisory-level employees from engaging in romantic relationships with their direct reports. It was the kind of policy that exists precisely because situations like this one are not rare, and because companies have learned that ignoring them becomes expensive. I closed the PDF, sat in my car for 11 minutes, watched the numbers change on the dashboard clock. Then I called a divorce attorney. Her name was Annette. Midtown, office, reputation that different women in my professional network had mentioned over the years in contexts that suggested they were glad they'd called her. When I showed her the investigator's report during our first meeting, she leaned back in her chair and said, "The person who files first controls the narrative. The person who's prepared wins." I hired her that afternoon. She drafted the initial paperwork, but I asked her to wait. I told her I needed one more thing. Something witnessed, something public enough that it couldn't be reframed later as paranoia or emotional instability. One clear, undeniable moment with an audience. That moment came at the gala. His firm held an annual awards dinner every October at a hotel in Buckhead. Black tie, open bar, the kind of event that exists so commercial real estate professionals can confirm to each other that they're doing well. He had been nominated for Top Producer of the Year. Genuinely significant. Something he'd been working toward for 3 years. I had watched him work toward it. I had covered more dinners alone, and more weekends interrupted by client calls than I'd kept track of, and I had been proud of him for it, once, before the spreadsheet. I got dressed carefully that night. A navy dress I'd bought 2 months earlier, fitted, the kind I knew worked on me. I had my hair done at a salon in Virginia Highland. I was ready by 6. He left an hour before me, said he needed to arrive early, that there were people to greet before the program started. He kissed the top of my head, not my mouth, not my cheek, and walked out. I heard his car back out of the driveway. I stood in the entryway in my navy dress for a moment alone, and then I got my keys and drove to the hotel by myself. The ballroom was everything these events always are. Vast, expensive, slightly too loud. White tablecloths, elaborate centerpieces, a stage at the front with a podium and the firm's logo on a banner behind it. I found him within 4 minutes of walking in. He was with her. I recognized her immediately from the investigator's photographs. Mid-20s, dark hair pulled up, wearing a strapless burgundy dress that someone had clearly told her was her best color. He was standing close to her, closer than colleagues stand at professional events, and his hand was resting at the small of her back in a way that was not new, not tentative. The hand of someone who has put it there many times before. I stood near the bar and watched for 3 minutes. Long enough to see the familiarity between them, the private language of people who have spent time alone together. The shorthand glances, the small shared references, the way they angled their bodies toward each other in a room full of people. Long enough to watch two of his colleagues notice, exchange a look, and then shift their gaze toward me with expressions I recognized. They knew exactly what they were looking at, and they were calculating whether I did too. I walked over. He saw me approaching and something moved across his face. Not guilt so much as rapid recalculation, the micro-adjustment of someone deciding on a version of things. She saw me half a second later and rearranged her expression into something carefully pleasant. "Hey," he said, in a tone so deliberately neutral it was almost loud. "You made it." He handed her nothing. He introduced me with my name and no other information. Not my wife. Not "this is my wife Claudia." Just my name said to her like I was a peripheral acquaintance he'd bumped into at a conference. She extended her hand. Said she'd heard so much about me. Her eyes didn't align with the warmth she was performing. For the next 90 minutes, I attempted to exist in that room as his wife. I tried to join conversations. I was talked over twice and redirected around the edges of shared references. I wasn't supposed to understand. When I mentioned the silent auction items, he gave a short, distracted answer and turned back to her. When she leaned in to say something close to his ear, he smiled in a way I hadn't seen on his face in over a year. A colleague of his, a man named Stuart who had been at our wedding, who I'd always liked, positioned himself near me at some point and spent 15 minutes talking about nothing in particular. He was trying to give me something to look at other than what I was looking at. It was genuinely kind of him. It also made me want to disappear. Eventually I was done. I walked back to where my husband was standing and said, quietly, that I was ready to leave. He didn't lower his voice when he answered. He said, "You've been here less than 2 hours. If you're not enjoying yourself, why don't you just head home?" He said it the way someone says something to a room, not just to a person. He turned back to the group with the small apologetic expression of a man who is framing his wife as a difficulty he manages. She looked at the floor. The colleagues near them looked at each other. Stuart, somewhere a few feet behind me, went completely still. 3 seconds. Then I said, "You're right," picked up my clutch, and walked out through the lobby, past the valet stand, into the parking deck, and to my car. The drive home was 25 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove through Friday night Buckhead traffic and breathed steadily and thought about nothing, which is a skill you develop when your profession requires staying calm inside other people's disasters. Our house was dark. I sat in the driveway for a moment looking at the oak floors glowing faintly through the window from the porch light I'd left on. Then I went inside. I opened the good bourbon, a Kentucky bottle we'd been saving for a suitable occasion, over $90, on the shelf for 14 months. I poured a glass, sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and my phone, and opened the folder marked vendor contracts. Then I did 3 things. I texted Stuart, "I know what you saw tonight, I'm handling it. Can we talk this week?" His response arrived 6 minutes later. "Anytime. I'm sorry, Claudia, you deserved better than that." I called Annette. It was nearly 10:30 on a Friday night. She answered on the 3rd ring, because experienced attorneys who work with women in this particular kind of situation tend to be reachable when it matters. I said, "I have what I need. File Monday morning." She said, "Come in tomorrow to sign the paperwork. Name your time." And then I looked very carefully at our home equity line of credit. We had a HELOC with an $80,000 limit, standard for our home's appraised value in Sandy Springs. We'd drawn on it twice, once for a kitchen renovation, once for a new roof. The current balance should have been around $18,000. It was $43,000. $11,000 had been drawn over the previous 8 weeks, in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. I sat with that number and the transaction dates for a long time, cross-referencing the dates against the investigator's timeline in my head. Then I screenshotted the entire transaction history and added it to the vendor contracts folder. Saturday morning, I went to Annette's office and signed the paperwork. I showed her the HELOC records. She told me that in Georgia, dissipation of marital assets is a factor court's way in equitable distribution proceedings. What he had done with that money was not just dishonest, It was legally documented self-dealing. Monday at 10:15 a.m., a process server walked into the conference room, where my husband was presenting a quarterly market analysis to his team, and 2 junior agents he'd been mentoring. I had told Annette the room and the time. I had known his Monday schedule for 5 years. Stuart texted me 8 minutes later. It happened. He went white. She was in the room. She left before the server finished speaking. His firm received a formal HR complaint that same morning. The complaint included the investigator's report, the time-stamped photographs, the hotel and restaurant receipts from our shared account, a copy of the firm's ethics policy with the relevant supervisory relationship provision highlighted, and a written summary I had composed myself because, again, documenting policy violations is what I do professionally. I had been thorough. I am always thorough. He called me 14 times between 10:30 and noon. I sent every call to voicemail. His texts moved through the predictable stages: demand, anger, deflection dressed as accountability, and finally a version of remorse that never once named what he had actually done. I read them all. I responded to none. The HR investigation concluded within 8 days. He was terminated for ethics violations, maintaining a romantic relationship with a direct report, misuse of supervisory authority, conduct incompatible with the firm's standards. She was terminated on the same grounds. The company-wide email that followed used careful, legally vetted language that everyone read correctly anyway. 3 weeks into the divorce proceedings, Stuart told me something else. The $11,000 drawn from our HELOC. He had been making payments on a lease agreement for a 1-bedroom condo in Buckhead, high floor, view of downtown. He had signed the lease in September. He had been planning to leave me, with our money, and had simply not found the time to mention it. I forwarded that information to Annette. She forwarded it to opposing counsel. The settlement negotiations shifted substantially after that. I encountered her for the first time since the gala in February, 4 months later, at a pharmacy in Buckhead. She said my name from a few feet away, and I turned around, and she looked entirely different. Thinner in the way that isn't really about health, hair pulled back, wearing a coat that had probably fit her better before the last several months. She asked if we could talk for a few minutes. I said I didn't see why. She said, please. We stood near the blood pressure monitors at the back of the store, which was not a dignified setting, but she hadn't chosen the setting. She said she hadn't known he was married. She said he told her they were separated, that the divorce was just paperwork at this point, that I had moved on. She said he showed her text messages he claimed were from me. She said she would never have become involved if she had understood the actual situation. I listened to all of it. I don't know how much was true and how much was revision. Probably it was some of both. What I said was, he is a very skilled liar. He's been practicing on me for years, and I'm not in a position to feel sorry for you, because your choices are still yours, even when someone hands you a false map to follow. She started crying quietly, the way people cry when they've used up their arguments. I said, you're 26. You have time to build something back. That's more than I can say for his career, or for the condo he signed a lease on using money we'd been saving for our future, while I was home waiting for him to come back from another client dinner. She didn't answer that. I picked up my prescription and left. The divorce was finalized in April. Georgia's equitable distribution standard meant the settlement wasn't automatic, but Annette had built a complete picture: the documented dissipation of marital assets, the clear record of the affair, the evidence that I had been carrying the larger share of our household finances for the past 2 years, while his commissions quietly declined. I kept the house. He kept his car and a retirement account that was considerably smaller than mine. The HELOC balance was assigned entirely to him, along with the Buckhead lease he had already defaulted on when the income disappeared. I had the locks changed the afternoon the final judgment was entered. 6 months later, my company offered me a promotion to Senior Director of Compliance for the Southeast region. My manager called me into her office on a Tuesday morning and said the salary that came with it, and I asked her to repeat it because the number was higher than I'd expected. She said I'd been doing senior director work for 2 years, and it was past time the compensation caught up. I went home that evening to a house that was legally and entirely mine. I'd repainted most of it over the winter. A warm terracotta in the dining room, Soft sage in the bedroom I'd chosen because I liked it, not because I was anticipating anyone else's opinion about it. I'd started cooking the way I'd always wanted to. Actual cooking from actual recipes. Things I'd been meaning to try for years, but had set aside because it was easier to work around someone else's preferences. I made a curry one weekend that scented the whole house for 2 days and was almost perfect. I made it again the following weekend and got it right. I finally got the dog. Some evenings I sit on the back porch with a glass of wine and think about that night in Buckhead. The ballroom, the chandeliers, his hand on her back. Being introduced as my name and nothing else. The precise quality of being invisible in a room full of people who could see you perfectly clearly. And then the lobby floor under my heels as I walked out, the parking deck, the drive home in the dark. He had meant it as a dismissal. He'd said head home the way people say something to end a conversation, with the confidence of someone who believes they've already decided what happens next. He had no idea that I'd spent 3 weeks building something he would never see coming, or that there was a folder on my work laptop that was waiting for exactly that moment. He tried to reach me once, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. A number I didn't recognize. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. That he wanted to talk, that he'd changed. I blocked it without responding. Not from anger. I'd finished being angry somewhere around the time I signed the final paperwork. The way you stop fighting a current once your feet are already on solid ground. I blocked it. Because there was simply nothing left in me that required hearing from him. He had become irrelevant in the most complete and uncomplicated way. Not painfully, not dramatically, just entirely. He told me to head home. I did. And I built something there that had nothing to do with him. And everything to do with who I'd always been when I stopped making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's version of our life. If this story kept you listening until the end, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Mine was Monday morning at 10:15. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Velora Tales.